Hello, lovely people. Happy International Nurses Day. Did you even know it's International Nurses Day? Well, you should. Although, in the interest of honesty, I had no idea before starting on this video, which is in partnership with NHS professionals. International Nurses Day takes place on the 12th of May, Florence Nightingale's birthday, and has been running since 1965. This year marks 200 years since Florence was born, and has thus been designated by the World Health Organization as the first ever global year of the nurse and midwife. Particularly prescient considering the times we're in. The pandemic has emphasised to us all just how vital our medics are, reminding those of us in Britain how much we love our NHS, and nurses and midwives actually make up the largest numbers of NHS workforce. So, to celebrate those highly skilled, multifaceted and diverse professionals, I thought I'd try my hand at recreating some vintage nurses' outfits from the last 200 years, whilst running through the history of nurses' uniforms in the UK. Side note, this is International Nurses Day, so if you're from outside the UK, let me know what nurses' uniforms look like in your country in the comments below. I bet the differences we see around the world are going to be very interesting. And speaking of international, 18% of nurses in the UK are non-British nationals, which is really significant for me because if it weren't for the opportunities to travel that the nursing profession provides, neither my wife nor I would even exist. My nana Thelma was a nurse in the 1930s at the Boston Children's Hospital in the US state of Massachusetts, but at the outbreak of the Second World War she enlisted and was sent to the European battlefields, where she fell in love across an operating table with my papa, who was a surgeon with the British Army. They got married just a few weeks after they met in secret because service women weren't allowed to get married, gasp, and then settled in England after the war. And my lovely wife Claudia's mother Jeannie came from Malaysia to study nursing in the UK and work for the NHS, where she met Claudia's father, who is an anaesthetist. Thus, without the National Health Service and international nurses, we wouldn't have even come into being. So let's get on with our sartorial celebrations. If you enjoy vintage clothes and history with a side note of screwball medical conditions, then subscribe. The nurse's uniform has gone through many changes over the last 200 years, from floor-length dresses and aprons to today's variety of colourful scrubs. The design has changed along with our social mores and the changing interests in comfort, functionality and mobility. By the way, if you're thinking, wow, this looks like it was filmed in a building site, that's because it was. The building site more commonly known as my house. Yes, lockdown is going great, thank you for asking. I don't even miss hot water. Prior to the foundation of modern medicine, nursing was a family obligation, so female family members were expected to know how to tend wounds or care for the sick. Clothing was not designed for sanitary purposes, and they definitely didn't know anything about cross-contamination. Nuns and monks provided the only structured nursing care to ill and injured people, along with those who had long-term health conditions, although admittedly they didn't last too long back in those days. Into the 19th century, nursing was considered to be lower class, and most nurses wore servants' uniforms, which consisted of a black or printed gown with a cap and an apron. It wasn't until Florence Nightingale, a nurse from a wealthy and well-connected but liberal family, reorganised the care of wounded soldiers during the Crimean War in 1854 that public opinion of nursing as a profession changed. It had previously been the job of camp followers, generally wives and prostitutes, to care for the wounded with whatever primitive means they could. Florence insisted that conditions for the injured were killing men just as fast as the enemy and demanded clean bandages and bedding, fresh air, nourishing food and trained professionals to care for them. Through her actions showing that attending to the wounded, while there was still a chance of actually treating them, could make a difference, she saved countless lives and changed how war wounded were seen. No longer were they treated as collateral damage, and a grateful public turned Florence into an icon of Victorian culture. She believed that nursing is a very special type of job that takes a very special type of person. She wrote, "Nursing is an art, and if it is to be made an art, it requires an exclusive devotion, as hard a preparation as any painter's or sculptor's work, for what is the having to do with dead canvas or dead marble compared with having to do with a living body, the temple of God's Spirit? It is one of the fine arts, I had almost said, the finest of fine arts." At this time, there were neither appropriate nor inappropriate clothes for nurses, and in many images, Florence is simply depicted with an apron tied around her waist. The antibacterial properties of her everyday dress fabric was certainly not in consideration. I've attempted to recreate a dress that Florence might have worn here, but you'll have to excuse me any era discrepancies since I can't exactly leave the house to get anything. For her hair, I've gone with quite a popular Victorian style, featuring a centre parting and loops, which is what we call the hair draping down either side of the face. This was meant to cover the ears and then swoop backwards towards a bun at the back of the head. I've also included a chignon, another rather popular Victorian hairstyle. It's formed by pinning the hair low into a knot at the back of the head, typically at the nape of the neck. Braids were worn in the Victorian era by most women who had long straight hair, so I've included them here. If you'd like to see a tutorial for this look in more detail, then you can find it on my Instagram, where you will eventually see all of this video's looks. Makeup is, of course, incredibly light, practically non-existent. I had to draw in my eyebrows more though, because they're not very big by themselves. Or real. Florence went on to found a nursing school, and it was one of her students, Euphemia van Rensselaer, who created the first ever nurse's uniform, although nurses had already begun to wear lighter coloured gowns with white aprons and caps to indicate that they were nurses. It was important to have a professional uniform that distinguished trained nurses from those who were not. This consisted of a floor-length, high-collared dress, a long apron and a frilly cap. The cap was a departure from previous looks that more closely aped a nun's veil. There were no rules about types of fabric, so different hospitals had different styles, but all used colour in some way to mark rank and experience within the nurses. Bonnets or caps were particularly important as they held back the women's long hair. Women of this time period were known for having extremely long hair, and the most popular hairstyle at this time was the Gibson girl, where hair was piled on top of the head. Make sure you're following me on Instagram and keep an eye out for an IGTV tutorial on this look coming soon. This look was designed not only for protection against illness, but was also considered an expression of feminine virtue. Nursing was now a respectable job, and their dresses were kept suitably long with very tight waists. From the 1880s until the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the uniform changed very little. It became clear as the war progressed that former styles of nursing uniforms were no longer practical. Nurses needed to be fast and efficient to deal with the vast number of wounded. Bulky aprons disappeared in favour of more practical styles, and skirts were slightly shortened for better mobility. Only slightly there. Slightly. Hair was pulled tightly back to avoid pathogens and the general annoyance of trying to work with hair in your face. Which TV always seems to get wrong. They are constantly trying to battle trauma cases with hair swinging everywhere. Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service was the nursing arm of the British Army, and these nurses wore grey dresses with white aprons and large veil-like caps. Military nurses wore tippets, short red cape-like garments over the shoulders with badges sewn on to denote rank. Members of the reserve wore a cape that was only trimmed in red. The capes had a stiff Alexandra rose on the back that sat between the shoulder blades, and nurses joked that this was to prevent sisters from falling asleep on night duty. These nurses, commonly known as QAs, ranked alongside officers and were required to be of high social and educational standing, along with having completed at least 3 years of training in a civil hospital. Due to its royal patronage and the social standing it conveyed, the service was an attractive occupation for women. At the beginning of the hostilities, there were just under 300 army nurses available to look after the wounded, with 200 more ready in the reserve. It soon became clear that this would not be enough, and so, following the outbreak of war on the 4th of August 1914, the Red Cross formed the Joint War Committee with the Order of St. John, and nearly 9,000 trained or part-trained nurses were called into the voluntary aid detachments to serve under and with the QAs, although many women had been given only the briefest of training. Red Cross volunteers had willingly given their time to care for wounded patients, but their lack of experience meant that they were not entrusted with trained nurses' work, except in emergency. At the start of the war, VADs were known to have fluttered the dovecoats of professional nursing, due to their enthusiastic desire for the romance of nursing wounded soldiers. I mean, that's called misogyny, but sure. It was stressed to the women that they were expected to uphold the integrity of the service, and relationships must stay strictly professional. Women were expelled from the service for any type of romantic relationship with the men, even very chaste engagements. And yet these women who, thanks to Victorian society, had never seen a man in underclothes, were expected to deal with mutilated, naked bodies. Although we remember them as heroes today, many officers still felt that women didn't belong on the battlefield. Many of the women who volunteered, trained or untrained, declined a salary and were willing to be dispatched into areas of hostility. Nurses had to prove themselves over and over again as competent assets to the army who could provide skilled care that allowed men to rejoin the battlefield rather than be sent home. QAs were given the rank of officer in order to protect them and make sure their voices were heard when they were dealing with doctors, other ranks and high command. After tireless campaigning, the Royal College of Nurses was founded in 1916 and established a professionally recognised qualification. Medical degrees were also open to women for the first time during the war, which one of my great aunts actually took advantage of, so go her. Although the VAD's initial job had been merely one of support, it was quickly realised that Red Cross volunteer nurses would play an important role in the war effort, caring for the large number of wounded soldiers. Women from aristocratic and upper-class families, used to running large houses and estates with many servants and tenants, were drafted in by the Red Cross to run field and auxiliary hospitals, a feat at which they excelled. In her uniform of a long blue cotton dress and white apron emblazoned with her organisation's emblem, the Red Cross nurse became a familiar figure during the war. Many postcards and propaganda posters sang their praises. Famous women who volunteered for the Red Cross during the war included Agatha Christie, Vera Brittain, Enid Bagnold and Clara Butt, who was a superstar of the Victorian era. There was again not much change in style of nursing uniform until we come to World War II Army nurses. This late 30s, early 40s uniform was much more practical for the very physically demanding job of nursing wounded soldiers. It was also more in keeping with the times, featuring a much shorter hemline and a light blue dress with a pinned apron. The cape worn over the dress was navy blue on the outside and bright red on the inside with a scarlet red sash. I actually have one of those original capes. It was ridiculously hot on the day we filmed this, however, so here is a shot of me in the cape from another day. Again, the British Red Cross Society and the Order of St John formed the Joint War Organisation, offering extensive services for the sick and wounded, including soldiers, prisoners of war and civilians who needed help as a result of enemy action. The Joint Organisation created ambulance departments for transportation of the wounded, established auxiliary hospitals across the UK and organised volunteers. This is the closest I can get to the indoor uniform of the British Red Cross Society nurse. The short-sleeved, knee-length, light blue cotton dress should be with a turned collar, white apron with the Red Cross sewn onto the chest, a dark blue or red belt worn over the apron, depending on the rank, and a rectangular white headscarf and cap, with a Red Cross embroidered on the side. Normally aprons were pinned on with a badge on one side and a fob watch on the other. We did try pinning a regular watch on, but that was an awful mess. It wasn't just for fashion purposes that the dresses were shorter with half-length sleeves. There was a clothing material shortage during World War II, and supply of fabric was reserved for the army and the war effort, including the manufacture of bandages. Detachable sleeves were made use of, however. Excitingly, field army nurses, particularly those sent to much hotter or colder climates, were allowed to wear trousers. Pockets. Post-World War II, nursing as a profession continued to grow in popularity and uniforms continued to change. In 1948, the National Health Service was founded and nursing uniforms really started to flourish, with a range of new styles being introduced. By the 1950s, there was an increased demand for uniforms, which could be mass-produced and easily cleaned. Sleeves became shorter and caps varied from a pillbox style to a pointed version. Skirts and sleeves became even shorter, keeping with the style of the times. Fabric became very important as more became known about disinfecting surfaces and carrying bacteria through fabric. Revolutions in the garment industry introduced synthetic fibres, which were known to be more hygienic for sanitary uses. The dresses at this time became looser, less form-fitting, and were easier to wash and iron. Since this year is about celebrating nurses and midwives, I thought I would throw in this ode to the 1960s and 70s midwife, iconic for being featured in the television show called Midwife. Simple, folded hats, sometimes made of paper, replaced the large, elaborate crowns worn by nurses previously. Another pivotal change to nursing was in the 1960s, when the career was open to men. Their uniform was much simpler than the women's, featuring a white jacket with a high neck. More people at this time did their laundry with a washing machine, which encouraged nursing uniforms to become even simpler for ease of cleaning. This uniform continued into the 1970s with little change other than colour. White with a blue belt and stripes were worn on nurses' caps to show how many years of experience a nurse had. Disposable paper caps replaced cotton ones, but by the late 1970s hats began to disappear altogether. During the 1980s, the nurse's uniform became very standardised, and aprons were now disposable, rather than only changed once dirty, which, probably a good idea, yeah. The 1990s dress is the one most of us will probably recognise and associate with nurses in the UK. It was a light blue with white piping and a white belt and no cap. There had been a certain time in the history of nursing uniforms when the cap was a ubiquitous part of it. It conveyed status and symbolised a helping hand, whilst also fulfilling the very practical function of keeping long hair organised. But in the recent past, they've faded away. No official announcements or rules were passed by hospital authorities to stop the wearing of caps, although issues were brought up around hygiene. Nurses' caps were made of hard fabric that was not easy to wash, and as a result they were seen as carrying dirt around the hospital and from outside. Another reason is that due to modern hairstyles and hair elastics, the caps just aren't practical as they serve no significant purpose. They were also only worn by female nurses, which was a difficult gender imbalance to navigate, plus our NHS nurses come from a variety of different backgrounds and represent the diverse communities in the UK, with many choosing to wear head coverings that have a religious significance. So having a cap be the official part of the uniform would be very difficult to navigate. The nurse's uniform is now focused on comfort and practicality, which brings us to scrubs! Yes, I do actually have legs under my skirts. Shocking, I realise. And I'm showing off my Grey's Anatomy hair all over the place look here. Looks great on TV, not particularly practical. Trousers are now far more commonplace among female nurses, and despite all of the different looks nurses have gone through over the years, the most recognisable version in today's NHS is the matching top and trouser set. No more tights or belts, it's comfortable shoes all the way. This look is also noticeably unisex and can be adjusted across all healthcare trusts as it works in almost any area of the hospital, often with bands of colours to denote different jobs. These particular scrubs were borrowed from my wife, who's actually an NHS dentist, not a nurse, but many nurses wear similar ones to these, sometimes with their hair down, on TV. The fob watch has remained throughout the different variations in uniform, since nurses have always been discouraged from wearing jewellery which might get caught on patients or leave their wrists as a vector for disease. The fob or pendant watch is considered synonymous with nursing. Watches are often given as a token rite of passage gift from parents and family to young nurses. So if you or someone you know happens to be going through training right now, you now know the perfect gift for graduation. 2020 is an excellent time to reflect on the amazing, skilled and committed professionals who go into nursing, and to celebrate not only their willingness to provide expert clinical care, but also the impact they have on the lives of others. As someone with a chronic health condition, I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for some truly wonderful nurses to whom I can only give my deepest thanks. And thank you for watching this video on the history of nurses' uniforms. If you've enjoyed the video, please let me know by clicking the like button and leaving a comment below. Click through on my end screen now to learn more about NHS Professionals' International Nurses' Day campaign and watch a video about the great work that nurses do. See you next time.